I'm standing in the section of the museum known as the World War II display. There's a dedication to the men who flew an airlift from India into China, and I'll give you a little history as to why that airlift had to take place in the first place. Japan invaded China in 1937 and began to take over large chunks of land in China. The only resistance at the time of that invasion was by General Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese army, and also the British army. And so those two armies had to be supplied in order to fight Japan's invasion of China. The route for supply came through the Bay of Bengal to the Burma Road, which led into China, specifically Kunming. But in 1942, the Japanese captured the Burma Road. And ostensibly, the way of supplying both the Chinese army and the British army was cut off. Roosevelt and Churchill had to figure out a way to get supplies into China. And they did that by a very innovative air route that actually began in Dinjan, India, and flew supplies over a 550-mile route over the Himalaya Mountains. And this route was commonly referred to by the pilots who flew it as the Hump. If you take a look at this globe, I want to show you specifically where that air route occurred. You'll see India, Bay of Bengal, Burma, and when that route was cut off from Burma up into China, they had to find an air route. And the most expeditious air route was the 550 miles from Dinjan, India, into Kunming, China. Now, 550 miles doesn't sound like it's very far, but when you consider you're flying cargo over the highest range of mountains on the planet in some of the worst weather on the planet, you begin to realize the logistical challenge that creating and executing this air route called the Hump afforded both the United States and China. Here in the museum, we actually have a mural, kind of gives a bit of a tribute to the Hump. It stands behind me right here, and you can see a C-47 flying over the Hump, and you can see it's kind of dodging between mountains, and this is very typical, actually flying between mountains that were in some cases over 20,000 feet high. Flying in mountain weather is really, really dangerous because of updrafts and downdrafts and clouds that obscure the ground. You really never know if you're going to fly into a mountain or how close you are to the ground. The pilots who flew the Hump had to be very courageous, given the fact that their navigational devices were pretty crude, given the fact that their airplanes in some cases were not fully tested and most of the time overloaded. And so a lot of courage has to be awarded to the men who flew that Hump mission. I also have a display here, or a print, of a C-46. The plane up there is a C-47, and that was the plane that was originally used to start the cargo flights over the Hump. Later on, in 1943, the C-46 Curtiss Commando was introduced. And it's hard to tell, but the Curtiss Commando was actually twice the size of a C-47. More powerful engines, had a bigger cargo load, could fly higher and faster. And once this plane entered service, the number and tons of cargo flown over the Hump dramatically improved, which really put both the Chinese, American, AVG, and the British Army in a better position to fight the Japanese. Why did we want to do that? Because it was said that up to 1 million Japanese soldiers were hunkered down in China. And so it was very important to keep those troops involved in China so they couldn't be engaged in the island hopping campaign that the Navy was conducting. So there was a lot of strategic value to making sure those armies stayed in the fight. The Hump actually was conducted from 1942 to the end of the war in 1945. Those missions continued right to the end of the war. And by the end of the war, over 700,000 tons of material, and in some cases men, were moved around that theater by the pilots that flew the Hump. They lost almost 600 aircraft, and they lost over 1,000 men missing or lost. So there was a high price to pay for this early air route, and it was the biggest at the time way of moving men and material over a long distance by airplane ever done in history. I'd like to share a piece of World War II memorabilia with you. This is a World War II Army Air Force leather jacket, flight jacket, that was flown by many of the pilots who flew in World War II. This specific jacket was flown by my father, who flew in the China-Burma-India theater known as the Hump. One of the more interesting features of this jacket is it has a blood shit on it, and we have a docent here in our museum who is going to translate the blood shit for you because the blood shit's written in Chinese.
I'm going to read the blood sheet and then translate to English. So what I read here is 来华助战，美军军民护. What it says, this person is American, come here to help Chinese to fight Japanese. For Chinese civilian and military person, please rescue and protect this person. Thank you.
So I want to thank you for your time, and hopefully you learned a little bit more about the men and mission that was commonly referred to as the Hump.